Senator Pacheco, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me back. It's such a pleasure to be back here. I kindly remember 2018, Rye Brook, New York. And today I want to, and I've been busy since then. Last year I published a book called Rethinking Humanity. And our team, my co-author and I and our team looked at essentially 10,000 years of disruptive transformations at the societal level. So we looked at sector level and product level, and especially at the societal level with the leading societies of the time. And the conclusion, and I'll double click on some of these insights, is that we're on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation, not just of any one sector, yes, but also of civilization in that 10,000 year history. In the 2020s, just over the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, we're gonna have a convergence that is going to disrupt the 5 foundational sectors of the economy. Information technology, I'll talk about energy, transportation, and food today, and also materials. Now, those are not the only sectors that will be disrupted. Those are the foundational sectors, and everything else depends on those. So everything across society will be disrupted over the next 10 to 15 years. So we need to understand how these disruptions will unfold to be in a better position to serve essentially our society better. So this is my agenda for today. I'll start talking about how disruption really works. And that's based on the work that I'm showing here, which is rethinking transportation, energy, food and agriculture, and my 2 previous books, and a new report I published a couple of weeks ago, the implications for climate change. So let's talk about disruption. I usually start my talks with this picture, New York City, Easter Parade, 1900. After horses dominated the transportation industry for thousands of years, I mean, there is one car in this picture. And just 13 years later, there is one horse. So a 10,000 year old industry got wiped out in about 13 years. And that's how quickly disruptions can happen. In a disruption, just to be clear, is when a new product or service helps to create a new market, and also either destroy or diminish the existing industry. And it's usually the experts and the insiders and the mainstream analysts who dismiss disruption. I mean, smart people, some of whom were disruptors in previous lives. But I'm gonna ask and answer the question of why this happens. So how disruption happens, here's the result of 15 years of work. We usually have an equilibrium, whether it's societal or at the industry level. So at the industry level, for instance, we have had the car for about 100 years, and the value chain hasn't changed much. Elements have, I mean, there's been incredible technology progress, but the architecture has not changed substantially. Same thing with electricity. So we've had the power system for about 100 years, and we have swapped in coal, out nukes, in gas, and so on, but the fundamental architecture has not changed. So we have an equilibrium. Then there is a convergence of technologies. That convergence opens up a new possibility space. And think about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, when Tesla and other companies came into the EV space, and solar companies and so on. So that's when the opportunity space opened up. They come into the market, but here's something interesting. The incumbents, by which I mean the companies that dominate those markets, don't see this new possibility space. Mainstream analysts don't see that possibility space, but entrepreneurs do. So they come in, and I'll use the Tesla example, about 11 years ago. And over the following few years, they pushed the cost and capabilities until, so they enter the market and they push the capabilities until it ruptures the market. So this has happened already in both energy and transportation. So what does that mean? Rupture means the old rules don't apply anymore. The new rules may or may not be clear, but the old ones clearly don't work anymore. So we're past that rupture point in energy and transportation. And so what we have seen over the last couple of years is the shakeout that happens at that point. So there are accelerators that essentially feed back into the new technologies. And eventually those new technologies get adopted as an S-curve, as I'm going to explain, and they become the new system, and they become the new equilibrium. So I expect that to happen in the 2030s for energy and transport. And at the same time, there is what I call market trauma, which is that the old industry collapses. So that's how disruption happens. So when I look at I'm going to analyze a sector or society, I start with technology cost curves. So you know your computer improves for the same dollar by 100% every 2 years. That's Moore's law. And that's happened for decades and decades and decades. So essentially we know cost curves, which means the improvement in cost and capabilities for a given dollar. And each technology has a different cost curve. So for data storage, imaging, network capacity, and so on, each technology has a cost curve. So what I do is, and this is from my book, Clean Disruption, in 2014, when you make a good estimate of what the improvement rate is going to be over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and in this case, I assumed that it would improve by about 16%. And this is what I drew 7 years ago, the projected cost of lithium-ion batteries out to 2030. And again, the point is not to be 100% accurate, but to analyze the speed and scale of potential disruptions. In this case, as usual, I'm told initially that that looked insane. $150 per kilowatt hour by 2021 is not going to happen. I was told that hundreds of times. Guess what? It ended up being a little conservative. It's actually below that. So essentially, it gives us an idea of where the world is going. But single technologies alone do not usually cause disruptions. It's convergence. So if you ask yourself, why did the smartphone, both Apple and Google, happen in 2007? Why not 2005 or 2009? That was the year when the convergence of all the technologies that made a $600 smartphone converged. Computing power, data storage, lithium-ion batteries, etc. That was the year. And that was the year when any of 30 or 40 companies could have built a smartphone. But the companies that dominated the market, Nokia, remember them? Or did not see that disruption happen. But two companies, Google and Apple, who had never built a phone before, were the ones that dominated. So this is textbook disruption. And of course, here's how the adoption went. It was not a straight line because market adoption happens as S-curves, not straight lines. And so back to the car, we saw how the car went from almost nothing to 95% of the US market within 20 years. And this is more than 100 years ago. But the more interesting thing is that the bulk of the disruption, which in this case was from about 11 to 81% penetration, happened in 1 decade, in just 10 years, despite or because building 2 new industries, both auto and oil, building a brand new road infrastructure, fighting World War I, and the meanest pandemic in history. Does that sound familiar? And despite that, the disruption took place essentially in about 10 years. And that's not unusual. We've seen disruptions happen in 10 to 15 years across the board, from corn to coal to videos. It's uncanny how quickly disruptions can happen. And if anything, adoption S-curves are accelerating. So what used to be multi-decade S-curves are now happening in a year or in a few years. So, and that's because of the speed, the accelerating speed of technology development. And despite all of this evidence, despite hundreds of years of evidence, we still get the conventional forecasts wrong every single year. So this is the IEA. Every year they make a straight line projection to the future, and this is for solar PV. And every year since 2000, they've been wrong by about 30%. Every year they've been wrong by about 30%, right? And every year they draw another straight line based on just an extrapolation of the surface properties of what's happening today. But if you look at reality, look at that green curve, that's starting to look like an S-curve. So the reality is the adoption S-curve. But the collapse is also an inverted S-curve. And in this case, I'm showing the projections from the US Energy Information Agency. Every year they draw a straight line for coal, and coal has been, since it peaked, essentially going down a classic inverted S-curve of collapse. But every year, even this year, the EIA says, nope, this year it's going to go flat forever for the next 20, 30 years. And it never happens because of linear projections. So here's the question. Why do smart people at smart organizations consistently fail to anticipate or lead disruptions? And it has to do with what I said before, right? When a big opportunity space opens up, they just don't see it because they're looking through a straw. It's a linear mindset. They see the world like this, when in fact, in times of disruption, adoptions are S-curves. And one of the big mistakes that they make is the idea of what I call the faster horse syndrome, which is that folks thought that cars were a faster horse. And so it was a one-to-one substitution. We know that was not the case, but usually folks, smart people indeed think in this way. Another disruptive thing is business model innovation. So as we know, Uber went from an apartment in San Francisco with 3 entrepreneurs to more bookings than the taxi industry in America in just about 7 years. Disruption in 7 years. And they went on, the industry, ride hailing, essentially we saw how Hertz collapsed. So it's going on to disrupt the car rental industry. So it doesn't stop at the first disruption. There's always other industry to disrupt. Now, what I call phase change disruptions enable transformations into new systems with new properties. So back to the car and the horse, like I mentioned, the car essentially went from nothing to 95% penetration within 20 years. It wiped out the horse transportation industry, but it was not a one-to-one substitution. The car was 10 times cheaper per new metrics. It was 10 times, it could go 10 times further in a day or in an hour. It could last 10 times more. So it was not a one-to-one substitution. There were not just faster horses. And the system that it created, the car transportation system, we still live with. And it was even as far back as 1929, more than 100 times. The market was more than 100 times larger than the horse transportation industry. So when we look forward to the transformations that I'm going to talk about, they're going to all be phase change disruptions where the new market is going to be substantially bigger. But back to the ripple effects of that car disruption, we're still feeling. Essentially, we built the 20th century around the car. Essentially, geopolitics was about oil, the models of thought, cities we built around the car, and not for people, for the car. So those are the ripple effects across society. The way we think was transformed. Everything was transformed by the car. So it's a phase change to a new system. And when that happens, tastes and preferences, which many people assume are forever, they're not. They usually change. So in the case of the horse, if you wonder what happened to all those horses, we ate them. Now, not you or me, but essentially that was the clean meat of 1917. So, a transport disruption led to a food disruption. And today we're seeing a similar thing in the car. So information technology, the internet, the cloud, the smartphone are disrupting the car already, the value of the car. So things that we needed a car, an individually owned car to do, like dating, we do online. Well, I don't, but most people do. Movies, we used to go to the movies, now it's online. Restaurants, now we order out, and so on and so forth, right? So even work we're doing now online. So a lot of the value of the car has been destroyed. The individually owned car has been destroyed by information technology. So again, there's a long equilibrium. There is a convergence, which opens up a dramatically new, in many cases, possibility space. Companies, entrepreneurs rush in. The incumbents don't see it, but entrepreneurs do. After a few years, they push the cost and capability. They improve the cost and capabilities until it ruptures the system. Then there are accelerators that feed that new world. Adoption happens as S-curve. The old also collapses as inverted S-curves, and the new becomes essentially embedded and becomes the new equilibrium. And that's how disruptions happen. Now, 3 years ago, I talked about the disruption of transportation. I'm just going to show a few of my predictions and what has happened in the meantime. So again, in my book, Clean Disruption, in 2014, I published this curve for electric vehicles with 200-mile range. And at the time, I said that by 2020, there would be 200-mile electric vehicles that would be cheaper than the average median new car in America, which, of course, at the time sounded insane, not going to happen, right? I mean, folks were predicting 2040s, 2050s before that would happen. Guess what? It did happen. I mean, Tesla Model 3 is $35,000. We have the GM Bolt. We have, and in China, we have a number of cars that are way below that. So that is the cost curve. And what this cost curve is saying is that essentially by 2025 or 6, we're going to have $10,000 electric vehicles with 200-mile range. Essentially, internal combustion engine automobiles are going to be wiped out in the 2020s. I mean, we're going to have 200-mile EVs for $5,000 by 2030. And in fact, that's already been announced, which sounded insane when I mentioned it in 2014. So this picture, which I essentially have not updated just to show you how to track disruptions and so on. And based on that, we have almost all, not Toyota, but pretty much everyone else has, car companies have said that they're going all in on EVs by 2030 or 2035 or so. That's because that cost curve is pretty clear. The rupture point has been achieved, right? Now everybody understands that the old rules don't apply. And at this point, a lot of folks, companies and governments and so on are saying 90 to 100% electric by 2030. By 2030, now it's clear that it's pretty much over. And so I made also this prediction in 2018 when I spoke to you. I said that oil demand would peak at 100 million barrels in 2020 and then drop to $25 per barrel. And eventually in 2030, it would drop to 70 million barrels per day in demand. And, many thought that was insane. Oil is not gonna crash, certainly not to 20 and certainly not below that. And what did happen because of another disruption, right? The COVID disruption is that sure enough, oil demand went down to 70 million barrels and cost to 20. In fact, it went down to minus 20 briefly. So it can come down to zero pricing, and in some cases, negative pricing. And so this did not happen because of the transportation disruption, fully because of that. It happened because of COVID. But the point here is that possibility space that I can see and entrepreneurs can see, that the mainstream thinks are insane, do happen. And now this is considered a possibility, what I predicted 4 years ago. I said also that parking would be obsolete, meaning that with transport as a service, we would have 80 to 90% fewer parking spaces because of what I'm going to talk about, right? And we're going to have, for the first time in basically history and in 100 years, to redesign the urban landscape. And because of the COVID disruption, US parking demand went down by 90%, just as I predicted. Again, for a different disruption, but the point is that these constructs, the idea that parking is a human right or and whatever, that is a constant of the universe, are not real, right? It's just a human construct, and they can change very quickly. So the transportation disruption is, again, a phase change to a new system. And this is because of many reasons. Electric vehicles, I mentioned in 2018, have powertrains that last 500,000 miles. And now the industry is coming up with 1 million mile powertrain. And what that means is that one EV lasts 7 times longer than one internal combustion engine automobile. So for individual users, that's not that important. But for fleets that drive 100,000 miles per year, over 10 years, they can use one electric vehicle, one van, over 10 years, or 7 gasoline vehicles. So for fleets, EVs are already cheaper, right? Because they're using the metric that actually is important for the new transportation era, which is cents per mile. And this is why companies like Amazon are going all in on electric vans. Why? Because of green, not because of the other green, because it already makes economic sense for fleets. And the other thing about electric vehicles, of course, is that you can actually power your home with your EV. And in the case of a 200-mile EV, you can power the average American home for 2 days. Now think about that with the recent outages that we've seen in California and Texas and all around the nation. So this is something that it's not just transportation. Energy and transport are becoming one. There's going to be no difference between both. And at the bigger picture, electric vehicles, for instance, could store 71 to 100% of Canada's daily electricity demand in EVs. So, if you buy an EV for transport, this buffer, this storage is free, essentially, to use for to power your home. So this is a different world. And by the way, the Ford F-150 Lightning, the electric truck, can store 3 full days of the average American home electricity. So that is phase 1 of the disruption. It's going to happen in the 2020s. Phase 2 happens when the autonomous vehicle level 4 is approved. And I'm just going to touch on safety, right? Because the media mainly report on fatalities, but are AVs safe? Are self-driving cars safe? And there's very little data on this, but Tesla's data says that the autopilot, Tesla with autopilots, are already 8.7 times safer than the average human-driven car. Already, this is not level 4, not even close. And they're already almost 9 times safer. And this is predictable, by the way. In Rethinking Transportation, I predicted that by 2022, the Tesla with autopilot would be 10 times safer than the average human driver. So this is how the cost curves help with projections. And so today, if every car used Tesla autopilot, with this technology, which is improving super exponentially, around the world, we could save 900,000 lives today. And so the question for us is, at which point, what level of safety do we need from cars, from robotaxis to approve them? Do they need to be 10 times safer, 5 times safer? Because a lot of them are really, not in all circumstances, but pretty much they're going to make human drivers obsolete. But transportation as a service is the disruption phase 2. And this means on-demand, autonomous and electric vehicles owned by fleets, not by individuals. Like I said, it makes a lot more sense economically for fleets. And the other thing that I said is that AVs, autonomous vehicles, are computers on wheels. And essentially, the autonomous technology is like an operating system, Windows, Mac, iOS, and so on. And when you look at those markets, there's usually only 2 companies that take the whole market because of the dynamics of operating systems. So all you need is one company to achieve level 4 in order for this market to get going. The day that autonomous technology level 4 is ready and approved, that day, the cost per mile of transportation as a service will be up to 10 times cheaper than the cost of owning a vehicle, individually owned vehicle, any vehicle, EVs or gasoline vehicle, 4 to 10 times. This is a phase change disruption. It's looking with the million-mile actually powertrain that it's going to be a lot more than 10x. But 10x essentially means that it's a no-brainer as far as this disruptions. The average American home would save $5,600 per year by doing transport as a service, essentially robo-taxis, Uber, Lyft, or a public transport as a service, door to door, 10x cheaper. And so that day is when most people stop buying new cars. And in fact, TaaS is going to be so cheap that it's going to be cheaper than the operating cost of gasoline vehicles, just the operating cost. So 4 times. So even if you get a car for free, running that car will be 4 times more expensive than transport as a service. So the disruption will be quick, phase change, and very quick. And so what happened is that after I mentioned that in 2017 and 18, companies in the industries are coming up with a similar evidence of what's coming. So Tesla already said that its cars could last 11 years. My estimate was 10. And the price per mile would be less than 18 cents. Again, it looks like within the range of what I predicted. And so when this happens, the disruption is going to be like every disruption, an S-curve, right? And by assuming that level 4 AVs are ready and approved this year, next year, 2023, the longer it takes, the faster that disruption is going to happen. Again, because these things are computers on wheels, you just download the software. So 95% of passenger miles will be electric by about 2030, 95%. And again, this is for purely economic reasons. And because of this, because we're going to give up owning cars, not all of us, right? But by 2030, essentially 60% of the remaining cars will be fleet and 40% will be individually owned. But the number of vehicles will shrink by about 80% because we're going to have more cars going round and round and fewer cars that are individually owned. And the implications are stunning. So again, I showed this in 2018. Let me show it again. in a place like Los Angeles, with the freed space from the disruption of TAS, essentially they could build 3 cities the size of San Francisco in that space opened up by parking. So we need to start planning today for what to do with all that space. Whether we want it to be green, we want it to be for new businesses, for affordable housing and so on, we need to start preparing for that. So on that note, let me talk about the disruption of energy. And this is brand new work that I and my team finished essentially over the last year. And this actually has a story that starts at my talk, the panel in the CSG panel in Rybrook, where an executive from a utility said 100% solar, wind, and battery electric power systems are not possible. And that's the mythology in the mainstream, that either it's not possible or it's so expensive, it's out of control expensive. So I know at the time, but I had not published anything, that of course it's possible. So here's the work. We asked this question and answered, of course. Is an electric power system composed only of 100% solar, wind, and batteries possible by 2030? And if so, how much will it be? And what's the architecture of that? So let's start with the technology cost curves. And again, start with one of my crazy predictions. In 2010, I wrote this op-ed for the San Francisco Chronicle, which wrote, based on a book that I had published, that costs for solar PV would drop by 80 to 90% over the next decade, 80 to 90%. And I said, by 2020, unsubsidized solar power will be cheaper than subsidized coal, oil, and nukes. That's what I wrote in 2010. And today, here's the actual reality. Solar did go down substantially, and is now, even the IEA says that it's the cheapest source of energy ever in history. Solar is the cheapest source of energy ever, and wind is right behind it. So solar and wind are already the cheapest sources of energy. Not only that, what's called nearly firm generation, which means solar or wind, plus 4 hours of storage, today is cheaper than the operating costs of coal, nukes, oil, and gas power plants. Today, right? Now, this is 4 hours of storage. It doesn't mean that it can do 24/7 everywhere, right? But what this says is that any new investment in conventional generation, coal, nukes, oil, or gas, is already stranded. It's already stranded because solar is the cheapest source of energy. And the market, the wholesale market in the US is already adapting to that reality. If you look at the interconnection queue in America, solar and wind are 90% of new generation in that interconnection queue, 90%. So the market pays attention when it has to. And 98% of the storage queue is batteries. So solar, wind, and batteries are most of the new development in utility scale energy generation. And if you actually double click on that and look at what's actually growing, solar and batteries are growing exponentially, whereas wind is going flat in America, and gas is, of course, collapsing. And it makes sense. That's because it makes economic sense. And this is why companies are actually going all solar. So some companies that need in steel, that need 100%, lots of energy, cheap and abundant energy, like steel, are moving already to the sunshine, to the solar, right? Not just the sunshine, because it makes economic sense, because it's the cheapest source of energy, period. Now, we have this convergence of solar, wind, and batteries. And I'm going to show you the cost curve. So the cheapest sources of energy, solar and wind plus batteries, will become 70% cheaper over the next decade. So at this point, the disruption is inevitable. So when the cheapest sources of energy become even cheaper, that shows you that the disruption is inevitable. So solar went down just about what I predicted, 82% in the 2010s. And we expect a 72% drop in the 2020s. Wind went down by 46%, and we expect another 43% drop. Battery costs went down. Remember, people called me insane when I drew that cost curve, and it actually went down faster than I had forecast. So it went down 87%, and we expect another 80% drop over the next, by 2030. Put all that together. Let's answer the question. Is a 100% solar, wind, and battery system possible by 2030? And if so, what is the cost? So initially, we looked at California, Texas, and New England to look at regional systems and whether this could be done regional. We looked at real world generation of solar and wind, and also demand, hourly generation and hourly demand for all of the above, right? And we simulated the battery because there isn't that much battery in the market today, but we use real world hourly data for 2 years. And this is the answer. The answer is you have thousands of possible solar, wind, and battery, 100% SWB systems, thousands of potential systems. But here's the rub, right? So there goes that idea that it's not possible. Here's what we need to rethink. There's a non-linear relationship, non-linear trade-off between generation and storage. So the more solar and wind we build, the less storage we need. But it's a U-curve. It's what we call the clean energy U-curve. So the decision to be made is along this curve. It's not linear, right? So that's one thing we need to rethink, but thousands of potential ways to build a 100% solar, wind, and battery. So if this is the least cost system, here are the numbers, which is a key finding, right? That we need to overbuild relative to the existing capacity by about 4 times, right? So if the capacity today, say, is 100 gigawatts, we need to build about 400 of solar and wind. But they're becoming so cheap, again, cheapest sources of energy becoming 70% cheaper, that when you overbuild on the generation side, you essentially don't need that much battery storage. And what we found is that all we need, essentially across America, is anywhere from 2 to 4 days of storage. So we don't need the what's called seasonal storage, weeks or months that the mainstream, the conventional analysts are saying and the utilities are saying. We do not need weeks and months of storage. Here's the evidence. All we need in America, depending on the region, is 2 to 4 days of storage. But it's a non-linear relationship. Not only that, the cheapest possible electric power system that we can build in those regions is 100% solar, wind, and battery. Cheapest possible system, cheaper than even maintaining the existing system. If we start today and we finish by 2030. In America, it would cost less than $2 trillion to build a 100% solar, wind, and battery system. Over 10 years, that's less than 1% of GDP. And again, this is a phase change disruption. So we're going to have a new energy system with new properties. What does that mean? One of the key findings is what we call superpower, meaning super abundant, near zero marginal cost energy. So because we designed this system for the hour of the year with the least wind and solar resources, essentially what that means is that we generate massive amounts of energy free, right? The rest of the year. How massive? In California and Texas, we could generate up to twice what we generate today, 93% of days, twice, right? I mean, so it's a lot larger. And this is, again, free, clean energy. Even in New England, in 64% of days, they would overgenerate compared to the lowest hour of the year. The other thing that we found is that 100% solar, wind, and battery system is disruptive not just to electric power systems, but to all forms of energy. So if you look here for Texas, the blue is what this 100% SWB system would generate to cover the existing demand. And the orange is the extra generation. So it's twice as much extra generation for free, right? And that extra generation would cover all the energy for transportation when that goes electric, all the energy for residential heat when that goes electric, and all the energy that we would need for commercial, or Texas would need for commercial heat when that goes electric. Again, it's free, super abundant energy. So this is disruptive not just to electric power, it's disruptive to all forms of energy. And it's also the most resilient power system that you can build. In a place like Texas, for instance, they would need 2 days of battery storage, 2 full days. What that means is, I mean, think back to the outage, they would have had 2 full days of essentially electricity in storage. This should have been okay for 2 days. And even if the generation of the remaining solar and wind fleet went down 40 or 50%, it would still cover the electricity that they would need. So it is the most resilient and robust energy system that we can build over the next 10 years. And the other thing is that it's not one-to-one again. In a place like Texas, solar would need 9 times more capacity than wind. So the further north we have found, you go, the more wind you need until you find one-to-one. But in the South and Southwest, it could be as much as 9 or 10x solar relationship to wind. And the economics are also disruptive in the sense that because it's a U-curve, and this is the least cost system, when you add, say, a 10 or 20% investment in that whole generation infrastructure, it would generate up to 200-300% more superpower. So again, for the first time ever, I have never seen any energy system with these kind of positive returns to investment, where you get a 200% return on a 20% investment, incremental investment. This actually looks more like information economics. This looks like the cloud for Amazon or Google. So this changes everything. This changes the economics in energy. And so just to give you an idea, in New England, superpower with basically with a 20% extra investment, so here, would return 210% more superpower in New England. Additional 20% would return an additional 200%. And that's disruptive to all forms of energy. And this is the new economics of energy. So that could change economic development. How? Because in a place like Texas, an additional 10% investment would cost $21 billion. And that could power every data center in the world, every Bitcoin miner in the world, with electricity left over to make more solar and wind and batteries and so on. So this is super disruptive, and it changes economic development. So we need to rethink the idea of 100% solar, wind, and battery, rethink how we make investments, rethink economic development itself, energy economics, and consumer protection, because solar, wind, and battery is inevitable. And essentially all conventional generation assets are already stranded. So let me talk about the disruption of food and agriculture. And I'll go, so I'll start with insulin, which in the 1970s used to be extracted from animals. And you needed about 23,000 animals to get a pound of insulin. I mean, it was animal extraction, essentially. In the 1980s, Big Pharma developed insulin, human insulin, that was brewed from yeast, essentially like a beer fermentation process. This is what I call precision fermentation. So essentially, they modified a microorganism to produce this protein, insulin. And as you see, even though it's healthcare, it disrupted the industry in about 13 years. It disrupted this animal insulin market. That is precision fermentation. So beer fermentation, we know, grain plus water, essentially in energy. We have brewer's yeast and we get beer. Precision fermentation is the same idea of fermentation, except that we program the microorganism, the yeast or the bacterium, to produce any protein that we want. And this is what I call precision biology, is the convergence. Biotech from and information technology. That's the convergence that, for instance, gave us the vaccines recently. And the cost curve of biotech is insane. I mean, it makes Moore's law look positively linear. So biotech is going exponentially faster than Moore's law. So the disruption of milk, I'm going to cover, and meat is going to be right behind it. So all you need is 3% of solid proteins. Milk is 3% solid proteins. All you need is to disrupt that 3% to disrupt the dairy industry. You don't need to disrupt the water. All you need to do is disrupt that. And this is a business-to-business ingredient disruption, because a third of the revenues of the dairy industry come from selling ingredients to essentially as commodity ingredients, which are bought, of course, on cost, protein shakes, protein bars, and so on. So if you disrupt this, right, just the protein shake and protein bar market, essentially the dairy industry goes into a financial tailspin. And we know that S-curves happen quickly: citric acid, insulin, rennet, and so on. Because again, you don't need consumer behavior change. Precision fermentation proteins, the cost is improving by about 100 times per decade, 100 times. So the rupture point, the cost parity is going to come around 2024 or 5. And by 2030, the cost of PF proteins, which again are brewed locally, will be about 80% lower, 5x lower than animal proteins. So we expect the dairy industry to be pretty much bankrupt by 2030. And a new business model is what I call food as software, which is, again, because biotech and infotech have converged, you can design proteins just like you design applications or videos. And it's a phase change to a new food system. See, the pattern repeats. And the possibilities are endless, even though the mainstream doesn't see it. We can see infinite numbers of proteins. This is not an exaggeration. We actually did the numbers. There are millions of proteins in nature, but we get most of our proteins from just 12 plants and 5 animals, which makes exactly no sense. And with PF, we can make human proteins, which you can't do with livestock, of course. Collagen, milk proteins, and so on and so forth. So again, we expect the dairy industry to be bankrupt by 2030, and livestock meat will follow the same idea, both with PF and with the later technology, which is cell agriculture. And this is, I mean, precision fermentation is 10 to 100x more resource efficient. It's 100 times more land efficient than the cow. 40% of the land in America is used by livestock, 40%. And again, all you need, I mean, is 2% of this is a composition disruption. The Impossible Burger, to replicate the aroma and the smell and the taste and so on of the cow, only needs 2% composition of their proprietary heme protein. Just 2%. You can disrupt the market very quickly. And there are hundreds of companies today going after eggs, pork, fish, and so on. So all animal extraction food essentially is on the block for disruption. So we expect that by 2030, the market's going to reduce the need for cows by 50% and 90% by 2035. We have never seen this quick disruption of the food industry. I mean, some of the implications are pretty astonishing. For instance, because so much of America, I mean, almost half, like I said, 40% of the landmass of the country is used for livestock, freeing up all of this land because of the PF disruption will free up a landmass the size of the Louisiana Purchase. Free. So there are negative implications, of course. Farmland values are going to crash and so on. But for the first time in history, we'll have this possibility space open up. If we put together the three disruptions, there are dramatic implications. And so into the 2030s, because the cost of all of these foundational sectors are going down, as I showed, dramatically by up to 10x over the next 15 years, 10 to 15 years, the cost of the American dream, quote unquote, in terms of what we consume for energy, transport, food, and so on, will be about $250 a month. $250 a month. So this will change everything. This will give us an opportunity to end poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, and so on. And this we can make happen in the 2030s. But in the 2020s, our system is out of equilibrium. So we're going to see increasing instability over I mean, you haven't seen anything yet. The pandemic is just the beginning. So because we're going to have both, for the first time in history, 5 foundational sectors being disrupted, and also the breakthrough of the 5 new at the same time. We've never seen that before. So we expect massive instability, narrowing buffers, and increasing fragility of our system. So the shocks are going to feed into one another. None of this is linear. Shocks are going to feed into one another. Now, again, there are massive positives. The 8 technologies that I showed, 8 technologies, solar, wind, and batteries, on-demand, autonomous, and electric, and precision fermentation and cellular agriculture, just those 8 technologies can help us reduce, over the next 15 years, 90% of emissions globally. We have the technologies that we need. Again, the idea that we need to sink trillions into R&D is not real. Just these 8 technologies can help us, disrupting these 3 sectors, can help us cut emissions by about 90% for purely economic reasons, and net zero by 2040. There is no other way to do it. And that can be achievable by the market. We actually looked at this as something whether the market could do, and what we found is the market can do. We need help in terms of policies and regulation and so on. But a lot of this can be achieved by the market. So I only have a few minutes. There's a lot to do, a lot of choices. So one of the things that I want to tell you, there's no going back to normal. No going back to normal. We're past the rupture point. 5 foundational sectors are being disrupted at the same time. We're facing, many crises in the 2020s. So we can break through and elevate America and humanity to amazing new levels of quality of life and so on. But we have to be careful because both the collapse and the breakthrough to the new system are possible. So we need to seize the upside and mitigate the downside. We need to plan for wholesale changes in land use. Again, this is going to happen for purely economic reasons. And big picture, again, we need to value resiliency, not just talk about it, pay for it. For instance, millions of homes and businesses with solar and batteries and so on would be a more robust system than a few large centralized power plants. We've seen that this year. The existing system is already past the rupture point. So the most important thing that we need to remember because of the high volatility in the next decade is that we need to protect people, not businesses, not especially legacy businesses that are already collapsing and whose assets are going to be stranded. We need to protect people. Ensuring social stability will be key to expanding social safety net, lowering barriers to mobility. And here's the thing, it's not just, we need to help people, individuals, with retraining and financial support and so on. That's critical. We need to do that because, industries are going to be swapped out and then swapped back in. And the thing is that whole towns may be disproportionately affected by this. And, for instance, the disruption of food and ag is going to leave whole towns, whole areas in the Midwest essentially at risk. So we need to make sure that we're prepared to essentially help maintain stability at all levels. So a few things specifically, energy, we need a Bill of Rights. So Americans need the right to generate, store, power their own home and trade electricity as a right, not without needing permission from the monopoly. This is going to create a robust, clean, resilient energy system for purely economic reasons, because PV, as I said, is so cheap and it's becoming a lot cheaper. So this is critical to both, the disruption of energy and transportation. And self-generation would create the condition to electrify the rest of the home, right? Heat and so on and so forth. So we need an energy Bill of Rights. So think internet. Think of the new energy system as the internet, where we have the right to trade both information and matter, right? But not electricity. We need well-designed, open, transparent, and competitive retail electricity market. So we need competitive markets at the retail level where anybody can sell to anybody. So that means that the distribution needs to be independent of essentially generation, transmission, and so on. So distribution needs to be competitive where anybody can sell to anybody. And where the distribution essentially ensures stability of the system and also makes money on transaction. So that if you sell to your neighbor or back to the grid and so on, then essentially they would be making money on transactions, right? Transportation, we need to encourage autonomous, electric, and on-demand so that this can happen quickly. We need to educate the public on the benefits individually, almost $6,000 a year in savings per family. And also the idea that it's actually safer already. Land use benefits when parking disappears and so on. We need to create, this is important, we need to adapt metrics and taxation to the new system, which means cents per mile, because gasoline taxes are gonna disappear in the 2020s. So we need to replace it, but the new system is essentially cents per mile. And we need clear rules around insurance. And I think no-fault insurance, which we already have, can be used, where you pay to the insured vehicle owner, regardless of essentially fault. So to wrap it up, we're on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of society. And that includes energy, transportation, food, infrastructure, cities, that I have seen ever in studying 10,000 years of transformations. And this is not an energy transition. It's not going to be linear. It's not going to be slow. This is a technology disruption. And we're essentially past the rupture point for energy and transport. And we're going to get to that in food by 2024. Thank you.